Hello and welcome to this virtual roundtable panel, Medical Cannabis Unlocking the Plant's Potential. My name is Marilyn de Guzman and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. This roundtable is hosted by Grow Opportunity Magazine in collaboration with the Cannabis Council of Canada and sponsored by Reformulary Group and AirMed. I'm looking forward to getting into this important discussion with our panelists today. But before we begin, just some housekeeping reminders. The audience will be in listen-only mode. You can ask a question to any or all of our panelists by typing them in the question box on your webinar panel. We will try to get to as many questions as possible within our time frame. This webinar is being recorded and all attendees will receive a link to the webinar recording following this event. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First up is Helen Stevenson. She's the co-founder and CEO of Reformulary Group, Inc., a healthcare company that built a proprietary evidence-based drug list, the Reformulary, and the award-winning Drug Finder tool. The company has also recently launched the Cannabis Standard, an online platform for Canadians to discover medical cannabis, search comparable products, and track their health. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you.
And we also have Dr. Sean Bevan. She's the Chief Mission Officer at the Arthritis Society, responsible for driving the scientific research, advocacy, public policy, and information and support agenda. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks for joining us.
And we also have on the phone joining us today is Daniel Schechter, an experienced physician in the area of medical cannabis. He's currently the Associate Director of Clinical Education at Santé Cannabis, one of Canada's leading clinical and research organizations. Hi, Daniel.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and I apologize I can't be there on video with you. I'm having some technical difficulties.
That's
As
okay.
they say in Star Trek, I'm a doctor, not an engineer.
There you go. Well, thanks again, Jess, for joining us today in this important discussion. So let me begin this conversation, I guess, by going around the table for everyone to provide a brief overview of your background and the work you and your organization is doing in the area of medical cannabis. Let's start with Helen and then Sean and then Daniel.
Sure. Thank you so much, Marilyn. So I have a 20-year consulting career in healthcare, and at one point in my career was asked to go into the Ontario government and lead big reforms of the prescription drug system in Ontario. It spanned governance, accountability, pricing, innovation, etc. I was there for 5 years and was also Assistant Deputy Minister of Health and what was called the Executive Officer of the drug program. And so when I left, I was very much inspired by the governance and founded Reformulary Group. We built a drug formulary for the private sector, meaning employers, associations, etc. And through that, our customers started to ask us about medical cannabis. So we reflected on what we do well, and I'll say, voila, it was Cannabis Standard. Daniel is one of the, I'll say, our founding clinicians that worked with us on the creation of it. So I'm delighted to be on this panel with him as well. And just a quick comment then on Cannabis Standard. So again, with the guidance of our team, our committee of medical experts, we undertook a very thorough review of the evidence for medical cannabis globally and reviewed hundreds of clinical publications to identify where there was good quality evidence for medical cannabis and specifically to what symptoms of which medical conditions. And based on that, created a platform which provides, helps guide someone who's interested in medical cannabis in identifying whether they may be a good candidate for it. And then we equip them with information and documentation to have a conversation with their healthcare practitioner. It also has a quality of life survey, but I'll just sort of pause there and carry on.
All right, Sean?
Great. So I'm Sean Bevan. I'm the Chief Science Officer at the Arthritis Society, as Marilyn said. So I'm trained as a PhD scientist, but I've spent the last 15 years or so in the health charity space, and the last 3.5 years of that actually at the Arthritis Society. So we spend a lot of time at the Arthritis Society thinking about medical cannabis, and the reason for that is really quite simple, and that is that we know that many people that are turning to medical cannabis are turning to medical cannabis to help alleviate their symptoms of pain. And the root cause for many, many people is arthritis and other musculoskeletal conditions. So we were actually really involved with the establishment of the medical stream in the first place. And really what we helped to do was bring that patient experience to the forefront so that people could really understand the impact that medical cannabis could have and does have on patients. And now we're really focused on making sure that patients and potential medical cannabis patients have that evidence-based information that they need to help understand what's what and what might be appropriate for them. But also really from an advocacy perspective, making sure that people have access to medical cannabis more broadly than they do now, potentially. And also to make sure that it's affordable for people. You know, we don't pay taxes on any other drugs, but we do for medical cannabis as an example. So, you know, the bottom line really is that at the Arthritis Society, if medical cannabis is being used as a medicine, we want to try to make sure that it's being treated as such.
Great. Daniel?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I've really been privileged. I've been in the medical cannabis world for the past dozen years. I started off interning and being a research assistant with some of the leading researchers in medical cannabis, and really that gave me a passion for incorporating cannabis into patients' treatment plans. And when I went out onto practice on my own, I saw many people who were struggling and can benefit from this medication, and so many physicians who were resistant to it. So I wanted to increase access for patients and also try to change culture of medicine by educating physicians about the cannabis's potential. So with that in mind, I started up one of Canada's first clinics dedicated to medical cannabis that is now Cannabo Medical Clinic. And I'm so proud to say that we have treated and helped over 85,000 people decide whether cannabis is right for them. And as part of that, I've also been involved in education, and I have traveled across Canada and educated thousands of physicians and pharmacists to really think about cannabis in a different way, about its therapeutic potential. And also, I've been really fortunate to be involved in a number of medical cannabis startups around the world. So I've been able to give some of the experience and benefits of the mistakes that we have made here in Canada to help these emerging countries and markets not make some of the mistakes that we have made. And nowadays, I'm really focused at Santé Cannabis, bringing their educational possibilities and offerings to Canadians and international. So I'm really happy to be here.
Right. It's great that all three of you are come really from different providing some different perspectives, coming from the different realms of this world. Basically, I want to ask all of you. Maybe we'll start with Daniel. What are some of the barriers that you're seeing from your, from your perspective, from your respective communities to patient access of medical cannabis, and what are your thoughts on how those barriers could be addressed?
So there's a few barriers. First of all, there's a big barrier because there's still stigma associated with medical cannabis. One of the ways that we can address this is maybe changing the term. And I like to use the term cannabinoid-based medicine, or an acronym called CBM. And that just takes a little bit of the stigma out of it. Furthermore, I think, as Sean said, cost is a huge barrier. We know that the majority of people who are using cannabis are either elderly or have chronic medical conditions and are often on low income. And the fact that patients have to pay not only for their medication, but pay taxes on it and a premium is absolutely unacceptable and prevents people from getting the best treatment possible and prevents them from being able to often return to work or reduce other medications. And lastly, I would say a main barrier is physicians still thinking that people who come to them asking about medical cannabis want to get high. They don't understand that people are looking to cannabis because they are out of options and they want to get better. They want to be able to function better, play with their grandchildren, do some gardening, get some sleep, have a little bit of enjoyment of a meal. and nothing more than that. They just want to get better. And that means that we still have a lot of education to do.
Right. And Sean, do you have anything to add to that from your from the community that you represent, the Arthritis Society? Anything to add in terms of barriers and how those barriers could be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Daniel just said, and just maybe to build on that a little bit more. Certainly, there's a piece around healthcare professional education, and we hear a lot from patients that sometimes their clinicians don't even want to talk about medical cannabis. And it relates to the stigma, and it relates to the evidence, and it relates to a lot of different things, but certainly that's a piece that we need to work on. Patients also want to know more. When we do, large scale education sessions, not dissimilar from this, we literally get thousands of people online asking questions about medical cannabis, its potential for them, and people just want to know more. So I think that's certainly something that we need to continue to focus on. And maybe the last piece I'll mention, and this does relate to emerging research, but we still have work to do to understand, what formulations of medical cannabis should be given to particular people in particular conditions. We know some, but we have more work to do. So I think that's a piece where if we had more authoritative language around some of the indications and some of the ways that we would recommend medical cannabis, I think that would put some patients at ease.
Right. And Helen, anything to add to that?
Not really. I think they've really thoroughly identified some of the challenges.
Right. We have a question. Maybe Sean, you can answer this. So one of our attendees asking if we could have a plant scientist at the panel. But I think in your work, Sean, doing your research, what are some of the emerging research or trends that you're seeing based on the evidence side of things in terms of the potential of medical cannabis, and where are the areas of developments that you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, medical cannabis is interesting in the sense that it's different from, other drugs where we would have done a lot of research to get us to the point where then it goes into clinical trials and then it then gets used by people. And so in a sense, medical cannabis, the horse is already out of the barn. We have many, many people using it for different things. So I think we have huge potential to understand what's happening in the real world. So how do we take advantage of that real world evidence to understand when is it working, when is it not, how does that inform what we're doing? On the flip side of things, we've also done a lot of work and made a lot of progress in just understanding how medical cannabis works biologically in the body. And so that's very, very helpful. And, more recently, we've seen some research funding go towards that. But, for example, one big investment that the Arthritis Society made with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research last year was in a new research project to understand, particularly for OA pain, what exactly are the mechanisms and what types of OA pain is medical cannabis appropriate or not. So really getting into some of those very specific questions to help understand when medical cannabis could be used or shouldn't be used, just like any other drug. So I think there's lots of work there. But again, just to reinforce, I think we have a lot of now real world data that we don't necessarily have when other drugs are being tested that we can certainly learn from.
Right. Helen, I want to ask you, we were talking about some of the barriers and just really providing information resources for patients around medical cannabis. Could you talk a bit more about the rationale behind Cannabis Standard and what tools and resources are currently available for patients?
Sure. And just sort of on my intro, one of the areas that we know really well is, I'll call it the payer market. So, organizations, be the insurers or employers, et cetera, and that market. And so as it relates to, it's one of the reasons we built Cannabis Standard is from those, I'll call them, private plans, so private employee benefit plans. We were being consistently asked about what to do, both from the perspective of how would one consider coverage, for instance, how do you actually measure the benefits, how do we, there are a lot of unknowns. And so that is the reason that we stepped back and thought, well, what do we do well? We put bring together medical experts, review evidence, and package it up in a way that's easily accessible for consumers or patients. And so that's really what Cannabis Standard is we did, and again, Daniel is on that committee and has been since the beginning, is we brought together a committee of medical experts. We set out to review the evidence. From that evidence, we built a big database, which essentially is really highlighting where there's good quality evidence. So for which symptoms related to which medical conditions, and then package that up in a tool that we call a discovery tool, where an individual would go in, answer questions, and depending on what their symptoms and condition are, may be a good candidate, and are then provided with documentation to take to have a conversation with their doctor. And that's really what we're doing, is we're providing documentation to have that. So a sort of a medical document, but very importantly, a note for my doctor that they can use to discuss. And we do provide dosing guidance, but again, it's really at the hands of their own medical professional with respect to that. And then we've built onto it since then in building an index, for instance. So sort of like a guide in terms of which which products can be substituted for others, which product types, for instance. And then from that, we also have a quality of life tool that has been used, I'll say, worldwide, although not just for medical cannabis use, but is really tracks your quality of life and what are the changes in quality of life over time. And just one final point on that, I think that's, I'd really appeal to people to use it, because to the extent we can use I'll say the medical cannabis community and patients who are actually using it, and your experiences in tracking that, it can become a very, a credible source of real world outcomes data, for instance. And so that is a tool that it's called Track Your Journey. That's a tool that's part of Cannabis Standard as well. And then we continue to build out further.
Right. So one of the key, I think, an important element to this is really the relationship between, as you said, the doctor and the patient. I want to ask Daniel. You mentioned earlier, there's still the hesitance among medical doctors in talking to their patients about medical cannabis, and I believe there's a study that the McMaster recently came out with, and they sort of did a survey of some of the Ontario family doctors about the reasons for their hesitance. Can you talk a bit more about that, about what you're seeing as some of the reasons behind these seeming reluctance and the slow adoption by medical doctors when it comes to authorizing medical cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, there's many reasons why physicians are hesitant. First of all, medical cannabis is unlike any other medication. Most medications are a single molecule that treat a single symptom. And many physicians see cannabis as what we would call, in quotes, a dirty drug, because it has so many different actions on the body, and it can treat things like pain, like anxiety, like sleep, like nausea. And physicians really don't feel comfortable using one medication to treat so many different symptoms. And they think that, well, there must be something else wrong with this, because it's basically going to get someone high, and how can it treat all of these symptoms? But when you speak to patients and you speak to physicians who are familiar and well understand cannabis, this is the very reason why they find cannabis so beneficial, because it is one plant or one product that can target many different symptoms and allows you to reduce other medications. Other reasons why physicians are really not interested at the moment in authorizing cannabis is because it's not dispensed in a pharmacy, and it's not even prescribed. Physicians are said, well, you have to fill out an authorization form, you have to counsel patients on where to get their cannabis, meaning you have to explain to them which licensed producer to register with, and then you have to counsel them on which type of product, whether it be oils, capsules, vapes, vaporizer, inhale, topicals. and physicians just don't have that knowledge or that time. And usually physicians are going to tell a patient, here's a script, go get the information at the pharmacy and go get your medication at the pharmacy. And until that starts happening, I believe that we are still going to see widespread hesitancy and difficulty with getting physicians to really take the lead in authorizing and prescribing. And really, that's one of the reasons why the tools that Helen has created and the work that Sean is doing is so important because it can streamline that for physicians.
Right.
It's
So,
also,
Sean, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
I can go on and on as to why physicians are so resistant, but those are a couple of the top reasons. So if you want to hear more, I'm more than happy to go on, but I'll let Helen and Sean respond to those.
Yeah. So, Sean, is it then? So, from what Daniel has enumerated, some of the reason, is it um, is also, is there a still a lack of evidence? Is that part of the hesitance, the lack of scientific evidence that supports the benefits of medical cannabis? Like, what are your thoughts on that in terms of evidence availability?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot for us to learn. There's no doubt about that, and it's different in terms of how the research is being conducted. For many drugs, for most drugs, we're used to kind of gold standard phase 3 trials, et cetera, that help us make decisions about what to cover, what to recommend, et cetera. So there's no doubt that medical cannabis is different. And I think one of the considerations here is that some of it is a risk benefit calculation, right, for every patient, and to understand, like any other drug, what are the risks associated with medical cannabis, but importantly, what are the potential benefits? And so this does come into some of the important research now that I mentioned earlier around understanding what's happening in the populations and the people that are using medical cannabis to treat a variety of different conditions, and what can we learn from that, and how can we synthesize and communicate that knowledge to make sure that patients and also healthcare providers can really take advantage of that to make really informed decisions going forward.
Right. Do you have anything to add, Helen?
No, I think no, I don't.
So I'll get to one question from the audience now, and this is a really interesting question around the use of opioid and the opioid epidemic. So, how can cannabis be better positioned as part of the solution to the opioid epidemic? Sean, I think this is sorry, Daniel. We'll start with Daniel about for this question.
Sorry, the question was how to position
How can cannabis be
cannabis.
better positioned as part of the solution to the opioid epidemic?
Yeah, so I really do believe that we have to double down on education. Recently, we have had some consensus recommendations published with regards to how to go about tapering opioids, that is, reducing opioids, and using cannabis as a replacement. And I think that we have to really, as a community who are interested in the possibilities of medical cannabis, get this information out there. We know that cannabinoids are safer than opioids in so many ways. Opioids kill, cannabinoids do not. Opioids cause addiction, cannabinoids do not when used appropriately. And cannabinoids can significantly reduce the dependency on opioids, on benzodiazepines, and many other medications. And the sooner that we get this information out to physicians and patients, the sooner we're going to be able to start saving lives.
All right. Sean, anything to add from the from your perspective?
Daniel's right, and when we think about medical cannabis now being covered on more and more, say, employee health plans, it will be interesting to see what kinds of substitutions we see in terms of what's getting covered and what's being used even through those plans. So I think there's lots of interesting things for us to learn in the coming time as we see more and more people, in some cases, substituting medical cannabis for other pain control mechanisms.
And is that something that patients are actively asking for? Patients that are on pain medications such as opioid, do you see them, looking more and more into medical cannabis as a substitute? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think patients are really looking. Pain is a very, very important issue for arthritis patients, and certainly looking for alternative mechanisms to control people's. Medical cannabis will not work for every patient, and I think we just need to accept that. Just like we wouldn't expect all drugs to work in the same way for everybody. But let's really understand who does it have the potential to benefit, and how do we make sure that those people do in fact have the ability to get that authorization that they need and make sure that they can help alleviate their pain symptoms.
Yeah. Helen, I want to ask you, we were talking about barriers to patient access before, on the one hand, and then the potential, now we're talking about potential for cannabis to address some real health challenges on the other hand. Like, what are you seeing as the opportunities for collaboration between the cannabis industry, in particular licensed producers, while ensuring that you maintain your independence as a patient advocacy organization?
Yeah, I think what will be important is, well, one of the things is really encouraging collection of, well, I'll call it real world evidence. And, I would, again, as I mentioned, suggest here the power of the patient themselves in, doing patient self-reported outcomes. Not only do I think or do we see that as a trend overall, be it prescription drugs or be it medical cannabis, but I think it's an opportunity in the medical cannabis space to really mobilize people and to contribute to building that base of evidence. So that's certainly an area I think that licensed producers could really help direct people to tools. Obviously we have one, but to tools that can be useful that way. And again, what's important is, using tools that are standardized so that we can compare the data. If just sort of using one with measures that, may or may not be relevant clinically, I think isn't going to help us move the bar, so to speak. So that's certainly one area. And I think, the other area, and the licensed producers, I think, are certainly out there in front of it with respect to the legislative reviews, right, that are coming up, et cetera, and just ensuring as much as possible that there still is a medical cannabis stream, so to speak. I think it would be and I think many others would say that too, a real shame if we lose that and start now pushing everybody to the recreational market. I think it's really important. Not to mention, I sort of having a deep understanding of the payer market, I think it's highly unlikely that payers will reimburse, recreational cannabis. So maintaining that medical one, to the extent we've made some progress in moving towards some coverage. It's certainly not at all. It's small at this point, but to be able to really build that, I think it's important. And I think licensed producers have a real role in that.
Right. And Daniel, what's your take on that? And I'm curious to know, as a healthcare practitioner, like what kind, or is there any kind of collaboration that goes on, or that you see opportunities for collaboration between healthcare practitioners and medical cannabis producers?
So I definitely agree with Helen that we have to encourage both healthcare practitioners to engage in real world data collection in order to allow that to be turned into real world evidence, in order to advance the science and advance acceptance. I think other ways that we can hopefully work with industry, specifically licensed producers, is by ensuring that medical patients are paying either the same or preferably less than what we see on the recreational market. At the moment, this is something that I've been hearing from patients quite a bit lately, that they're not sure they want to continue in the medical stream because it is sometimes more convenient and less expensive to get their product on the adult use or recreational market. So I think that's something that we have to really focus on, and that could be by supporting LPs and the community at large to reduce or eliminate the tax on medical cannabis for starters. But we really have to ensure that the cost is appropriate and reflective of what patients are able to afford. I've heard too many times that patients have to choose between food and buying their medicine. So that's something that I would like to reinforce, as well as supporting real-world data collection to contribute to real-world evidence.
Right. And Sean, are there opportunities for research collaboration with, or I think there, some things, some these things are happening right now, but at your organization and the work that you do, are you doing any collaborative work on the research side with some of the LPs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe just to take a step back for a moment, from the Arthritis Society's perspective in terms of what we do, for us, it's always about what would be of benefit to the patient. So in terms of a collaboration with industry, certainly that piece, before I get to research, that piece around education, it's come up so many times on this call already. But the need and the desire to be able to create and share unbiased, evidence-based information, I think is really critical for all of us. So I think there's a clear partnership opportunity with industry and others like the charitable sector. I mean, the charitable sector relies on donor dollars by our very nature. So how do we think about partnerships there that really help advance our mission, but also, the interest of the industry partners who are looking also to make sure that patients are informed about what we're talking about. And yes, same thing on the research side. I mean, really it comes down to unbiased, credible research that we can all be confident about. And so I think that there's lots of potential there. And part of it too is understanding, I think that, any credible information here, whether it's patient education resources or any new credible research, will certainly float all boats, right? In terms of making sure that people are more confident in medical cannabis and understand that there's some really strong science behind what we're doing.
Right. I just want to read out one comment here from one of our attendees, George Smitherman. Thank you, doctor. I hear about cannabis as a gateway drug, but for me, it was an off-ramp from opioids back in the day. So there's your real-world evidence.
Thank you, George.
Yeah.
So back to education. Maybe Daniel, you can start in this discussion in terms of taking back, maybe taking a step back in terms of with the medical practitioners. Is the education system for future doctors addressing this in terms of providing this information about medical cannabis now that it's legal and now that everybody's looking for it and it's the potential, it's really there. Is there opportunity for the medical system the education system to start addressing this in educating future doctors?
So in a way, you've hit the nail on the head, because we are basically at a position where the establishment that is responsible for creating the curriculum in medical schools has not changed their curriculum when it comes to cannabis. They still see cannabis as a recreational drug, and that means that it is taught in the recreational drug unit. We do not teach about the possibility of cannabis as a medicine. In fact, there is about 10 minutes that is spent on the endocannabinoid system, which goes to the heart as to why medical cannabis works. And it is absolutely embarrassing from my perspective that medical schools and medical curriculum does not provide a greater concentration on the endocannabinoid system and how to modulate this either using medical cannabis or other products. Now, one of the problems about medical education is that there is a lot that is crammed into 4 years. And if we want to give more importance or more units or hours to talk about cannabis and cannabinoids, they have to take something else away. So this is always going to be something. Now, furthermore, we do have other ways that physicians learn aside from just in school. We have residency programs. That means training programs in person. And the traditional and the best way that physicians learn is by following the expression that we say, see one, do one, teach one. So you see someone do a procedure, you do it yourself, and then you teach someone else to do it. That's the best way of being able to understand and incorporate this into your practice. And the same is true for medical cannabis. If people come, they watch a clinic for half a day, they get a bit of the understanding as to the concepts, they can do it themselves, and then they can teach a resident or a learner. This would be the best way. So if, and one of the ways that licensed producers could help to increase and improve medical education is by potentially giving grants to physicians to spend half a day with a cannabis knowledgeable physician to go in, learn the practice, to see one, to do one, and then to teach one themselves so that they can start being an independent and a smart and knowledgeable prescriber. The other things that we can do licensed producers are the same things that we've been doing, which are lunch and learns, educational dinners, webinars, training programs. And this is among many other things, one of the things that we're doing at Santé Cannabis in association with licensed producers.
Right. That's an interesting point. Anybody else want to add to that?
I mean, no, just to, I mean, Daniel's the expert in that area and also in terms of medical education, but also for ones who aren't, let's say, they're not in that, you know, their medical degree stream, for instance, you know, just I think equipping it again, I would highlight the opportunity to capture patients' own experiences and using that as a really solid base of evidence. I think that would be, it would be hard to argue with that, especially if you're using, you know, tools that have been, are really recognized as being valid tools.
Right. Another audience question here. Is there a platform where we can access latest research and clinical trials related to medical cannabis and its benefits? Sean?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, when we look at things like what's funded by the federal government, there was a new cannabis initiative in the last couple of years launched. So there's certainly a database around some of the projects that are coming out of that. Daniel, you probably have a better sense of some of the status of the clinical trials and the best place for people to go for information. Certainly at the Arthritis Society, we try to profile the work that we are investing in and make sure that that's public knowledge and understanding, you know, the status of that type of work. Maybe Daniel, around the clinical trials piece, if you have some recommendations for people.
So, you know, the problem with medical cannabis is that it's a little bit all over the place with regards to research and what has to be publicly announced with regards to research and what can be done under the radar. So there is a source that you can go to. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. And if you go in there, and this is basically a database of all clinical trials pertaining to all molecules that have gone through a research ethics board and is registered with the government. All of these trials are in that website. So that's a great place to go, but what we're missing there are other research that might be done on animals, on cell lines, not on humans. And it also is missing a lot of the clinical trials that are being done that is part of what we call real world data collection. Because for this, you don't necessarily need to get approval, and it doesn't have to be registered on that site. So probably the best way to go about understanding what is being done is by going to some of the research conferences on medical cannabis. Specifically, the ICRS is a great, it's a great yearly conference. It takes place over 5 days, and there you will see and meet all of the people who are interested in doing research on medical cannabis.
And this year, this might be a great opportunity for that because everything has turned, I don't know if that's a virtual event now, so people can easily access that without having to travel. Yeah, so.
Mary Lynn, if I might just add, so what our cannabis standard relies on all that evidence. So while we don't publish or post the actual paper or publications that we've reviewed of various trials, it does actually synthesize it in a way in terms of synthesizing, where there is good quality evidence and asking simple questions in order to then recommend. So just as it's a different kind of resource, but essentially has, a reviewed, not all, but a large amount of evidence.
Right. And that's really contributing to patient education, right? Everything that all the resources that we need, as much resource that we can provide, that's better. I want to stay with you, Helen, and let's get to the regulatory side of things. With patient access to medical cannabis continuing to be an issue under current regulatory environment, with the review of the Cannabis Act taking place this year, what changes would you like to see that addresses the challenges for the medical cannabis community? And I want to ask you this, Helen, and then I also want to get Sean's and Daniel's take on that review of the Cannabis Act.
Great, sure, I'd be happy to start. And so one of them is, the mandatory review will be launched in the fall. And as I alluded to earlier, we think it's really critical that the medical cannabis regime stays in place. One of the things, and just to reinforce a comment that Sean made as well, is with respect to the taxation, so the excise tax and HST. And as she, rightly pointed out, it doesn't exist on prescription drugs. And so as we think about this as, I'll coin, Daniel's term, cannabinoid-based medicine, then that would be, I think, a very positive thing to do. The second area I would say is, a commitment from the government to really create a basis for, more evidence and the potential role of medical cannabis, and to really, sort of open up and build forward that. And then the other is something that certainly we've taken a big step towards, but needs to be done. There's still more work to be done, which is really, again, around that, formalizing and the classification of it as a medicine. And right now, for instance, medical cannabis doesn't have a DIN. So DINs are what are called drug identification numbers, that every form or strength of a drug, a prescription drug, has a DIN. Certainly some of the licensed producers or some of the payers, the sort of the companies that adjudicate and process claims at the pharmacy, some of them have incorporated systems called PINs, etc., but they're not really standardly used, and also nor are they necessarily, are those PINs covered by plans. So as it relates to, that whole payer system, there's a big, in recognizing it as a medicine, there's then an opportunity to formalize that within the payer space. For instance, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've developed something called the Cannabis Standard Index, which is essentially a classification system for cannabis products. We do have both medical and flagged as medical, but also recreational. And we've had lots of discussions with Health Canada and have offered access to that specifically. So I think that's a big step forward, but there's more that needs to be done in really classifying it.
Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think I also would just use this opportunity to underline the importance of the maintenance of that medical stream for patients going forward. We think that's critical. Like I said at the beginning, it should be treated like medicine. We think that, everything that Helen said about access and affordability is important. And so ultimately, we want to make sure that patients are also using this under the guidance of a healthcare practitioner versus the recreational stream. So, we see our role in this really making sure, just as we did at the beginning, to make sure that that patient voice is clear and making sure that we can clearly communicate, the impact that medical cannabis has on patients and really the importance of this distinct medical stream. That's all I'll add.
Right. And Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know if this would be part of the Cannabis Act, but I would certainly like to see cannabis be dispensed in a pharmacy. I think that will go such a long way to legitimizing medical cannabis as a medication. And I would even remind everyone that in the initial MMPR regulations that were initially published back in 2013, it was supposed to be pharmacy that was to be dispensing the medication, but the Canadian Pharmacy Association said, we don't want anything to do with it. Now they do. Shoppers is a licensed producer and selling cannabis. Every pharmacy chain wants to be able to dispense cannabis, as they see this as a medicine and as a revenue source. So that is something that we need for patients and for physicians to be able to dispense cannabis in the pharmacy. The other thing that has to change for physicians to be able to adopt this is, instead of writing an authorization or prescription in grams per day of dried flower product, I want to be able to authorize or prescribe how many milligrams of THC and how many milligrams of CBD I want my patient to use once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, or whatever it is. So those are two very concrete things that I would love to see changed in the next iteration of the Cannabis Act.
Right. There's another question here from the audience, but I think you probably have answered kind of a little bit about this. You've touched on it with pharmacists. What role would you see for pharmacists in patient education, and what is your view on the education status of pharmacists today?
So in some jurisdictions, pharmacists are mandated that they have to have some education around medical cannabis. Once cannabis is dispensed in a pharmacy, they will be provided with a tremendous amount of educational opportunities. But from my perspective, there is no one better to provide education to patients than pharmacists. And that includes identifying potential patients for medical cannabis, for recommending different products, dosages, titration schedules, because they can see patients after a day, a week, a month, whereas physicians are often limited and only see patients every 3 months or so. So they are able to provide all of the education as well as a lot of the ongoing follow-up and counseling that patients are required.
Right. I want to still stay on that regulatory question, and this is for Sean. In the current is the current regulatory environment providing sufficient opportunities to expand the scientific evidence on the efficacy of medical cannabis, and is there room for improvement?
Yeah, I was
There's
trying to
always
answer a question. Exactly what I was going to say. I mean, the good news is that there are many researchers that want to explore these questions in greater depth, and I think that that's a positive thing for us to consider. Certainly, many researchers will express some challenges around just the regulatory, delays in terms of approval and wanting to get at some of that research faster. So I think that's still a challenge. There are still challenges around supply, just getting the product for people to be able to do the research on. And then, fundamentally, I think the research community would always go back to funding. And I think in this case, thinking about, targeted funding for this targeted area and how do we support that? So, I think there have been changes since the recreational stream was introduced and legalized, but I don't think those challenges have gone away.
Right. A couple of comments from our one attendee might be interesting for you to know. I'm developing a medical direct buy channel for a micro producer in BC. Soon, this is very useful. This is very useful information. We will have a medical direct buy channel at wholesale pricing. Yeah. Question about patient education, getting back to that, Daniel. How important is patient education when it comes to medical cannabis, and where do you see the shortfalls and challenges when it comes to patient education?
Wow, that's a lot of a question.
Need more time.
Yeah, if we have another hour, that would be great. But for patient education, I think we've done quite a bit of work over the past 5 to 7 years in terms of making patients aware of the possibility of medical cannabis. And if one thing that I've been seeing lately that is concerning me that we do have to put more education on is that everyone's coming in saying, I just want CBD. I just want CBD, thinking that CBD is magical and that THC is evil. And this is obviously absolutely incorrect. And each one of these unique compounds has a role in clinical practice. And I think that for patients, we really do have to educate them that each one of these is incredibly valuable and can really contribute to ongoing promotion and return to good health. I think that's something that we can really focus on and something concrete that we should be working on.
Helen, do you have anything to add in improving patient education around medical cannabis?
It's certainly a big goal of ours in the platform that we've produced, and really trying to put it in a way that's accessible, I'd say, by patients. So we are also going to launch something in the probably late summer, fall, called Clear on Cannabis, which is essentially it's kind of your questions answered, kind of. So an opportunity for consumers and patients to write in and ask questions, and we'll access experts in the area, be them legal questions, medical questions, access questions, etc. So we will be launching that. And I think, as just your question has pointed out, and Daniel's answer about needing longer than a few minutes to answer it, there's a real need for more education, and also, education and answers, let's say, from independent individuals. Not to say the LPs don't have value, but I think it's really important to have objective, independent advice.
Sean, from the perspective of the Arthritis Society and the community that you serve, are you still seeing? And Daniel mentioned about the stigma in the beginning. Is that still something that patients or patients from your community still have, the stigma around cannabis and the hesitance to take advantage of that?
I would say that what we have seen is just an increasing growth in the number of patients who want to know more and are curious. And I guess the one point that I'll mention is that our audience isn't necessarily who we thought it might be 3 or 4 years ago. One of our first sessions that we did, sort of an education-based session around medical cannabis, the average age was between 65 and 70, standing room only, in terms of people who were just curious and wanting to know a little bit more about it. So I think the people that are asking us questions are probably beyond the stigma piece, but I think it's certainly an issue broadly that we can't ignore, and something that we have to think about as we want to make sure that people recognize medical cannabis as a legitimate treatment option.
Right. Another question from an audience. With the existing workload pharmacists have, would education partners like well-trained cannabis coaches be ideal to bring on board? Daniel, want to answer this
I
one?
think so, yeah. I mean, if they can get, if there's a pharmacy that really does establish themselves as being a premier dispenser of medical cannabis, then they would absolutely benefit from having someone who's specialized in this. We have many cannabis clinics around Canada. All of them are staffed with cannabinoid educators who are extremely knowledgeable, highly trained, and have the time to speak with patients. And if there's a possibility of having a cannabis educator uh, involved in a pharmacy, I think this would be fantastic. I would like to point out that there is only one pharmacy in Canada where you can dispense cannabis, and that is a pharmacy in Ottawa called Hybrid Farms that has actually been approved as a licensed producer, but only for sale. So they've been able to set that up. They're having tremendous positively feedback, but this is obviously the exception and not the rule.
Right. There's also one comment here that so around the public education part, that's because public education is lacking and thanks in part to messaging restrictions at the LP level. So that back again to the regulatory regime. I think we have what time for one more question, and I want to address this question to everyone, just to go around the table. What do you see as the future for medical cannabis in Canada against the backdrop of a more robust recreational cannabis market? Let's start with you, Helen.
I still think there's a huge potential for medical cannabis, and related to a lot of the comments that have been made here in terms of, it being grounded on evidence, it needing to be, we don't want to drive people to the recreational market. And also I'd say from the perspective of possible coverage down the road from either your own plan or possibly over time from government plans. So I see lots and lots of potential.
Sean?
Yeah, I agree. And, we talked quite a bit about stigma today, but I think overall, we are seeing greater acceptance, I think, which is positive. And I think that, so long as we can maintain a medical stream, I think that it's really a good opportunity to make sure that people understand more and feel more comfortable, like I said, as a treatment option with medical cannabis. So, yeah, I'm very positive and very hopeful.
Right. And Daniel, future of medical cannabis?
Well, as long as we have a regime, I believe that we're going to continue to see a robust medical cannabis industry, but I think that the products that are going to be used on the medical side are going to be significantly differentiated from what is popular on the recreational side. We're going to be focusing more on specific products that are familiar to the medical patient, so capsules, oils, and down the road, potentially metered dose inhalers or other types of ways that we can provide a standardized, reproducible dosing for patients.
Right. And on that note, I think that's all the time we have. Thanks again, panelists, for sharing your insights in today's discussion. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you very much. Have a
And
nice.
thank you to our audience for joining us today. Until next time, and stay safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.